In this video, we're going to do a deep dive into the React useCallback hook. By the end of the video, you'll have enough knowledge to know how it works, when to use it, and how to use it in your own programs. If you haven't already watched my video on the useMemo hook, I highly recommend you do that first. If you understand how a useMemo works, you will easily be able to understand how a useCallback works because the hooks are very similar. Here's the difference between the two of them. useMemo is meant to cache the return value of a function, whereas useCallback is meant to cache the actual function itself. That is the only difference between them. Aside from that, they are practically doing the same thing. Let me quickly elaborate on this before we get into our code. So in React, we know that components re-render every single time its state or props change. Sometimes in your code, you might find that you have a function inside your component that runs some calculation. However, if the function is defined inside the component, then anytime that component's state or props change, that function is always going to get re-rendered every time the component re-renders. This can cause a couple of issues in your code. The first one is a problem we explored with useMemo, but we'll look at it again in the context of useCallback. That problem is unnecessarily re-rendering child components when you don't need to. So I've set up the following example to show you exactly what I mean. In this example, we just have two pieces of state. We first have count, and then we have isDark here. Count is just meant to hold a counting variable that we can increment, and isDark is just going to be a CSS theme that we have on our page. We have this function that's just called getCount2, and all it does is literally just takes our count piece of state and then returns that times 2. And now if we look at our JSX, you can see we have a couple of things going on here. So first thing to note is we have this button here that basically increments count by 1 as set by this onClick property where we're just calling setCount and then passing in count plus 1. So that is this button here. The next thing we have is this card component right here that just gets passed in a prop called getCount. And for that, we're just passing in the getCount2 function that we've defined up here. And then lastly, right below that, we just have a button that sets our theme to either dark or light by filtering this isDark boolean on or off. Let's take a look at this card component that we have really quick. As you can see, this card component isn't really doing a whole lot. And as I just showed you, this getCount prop here is just going to be equal to that getCount2 function that we passed in from the parent component. And we also have a piece of state here called doubleCount that should represent double the value of our count in the parent function. Next, we just have this simple useEffect here that just watches for this getCount prop to change. And anytime it changes, we want to run setDoubleCount to set our doubleCount state equal to the return value of this function here. All we're doing inside of our JSX is just printing off this doubleCount piece of state right here. So essentially all this program is doing is keeping track of a piece of state called count in the parent component. And then there exists a function to double the count, which also exists in the parent component. And then in our child component, this car.jsx, we are just calling that doubleCount function and showing it off to the user. Now let's actually test out our program. So if I press this increment count button, you can see each time I press it, it increments by 2. And then if I click this change theme, it changes it to black and then back to purple, back to black and purple, and so on. So it seems like our buttons are working correctly. Now let me show you something else. Let's go into our console here. I'm going to clear this out and then refresh the page. And then I'm going to start clicking increment count. And you can see that each time I click increment count, it is printing out updating count. And that makes sense because again, in our car.jsx function, whenever count gets updated, we are just console logging this out. So it appears to be working correctly from the increment count standpoint. The interesting part, however, is when you look at this change theme button here. So if we click it, notice how it also says updating count. So right here it says 19, I click change theme, goes to 20, and then it keeps going. So basically every single time I'm pressing this change theme button, it is also printing out this updating count. Which, if you think about it, is interesting because this theme here has literally nothing to do with the count at all. So why is this function, or this useEffect here, why is this running every single time the theme is changed? Well, it all has to do with the fact that every single time count changes in the parent component, the entire component is re-rendered, and therefore all of its functions, including this getCount2 function, are redefined, even if they are the exact same functions as before. So this getCount2 function is getting redefined on every single re-render. And because we're passing it down as a property to this card here, our card is seeing that the function has changed and is therefore triggering this useEffect to run. This is not honestly going to cause any big problems in our program, but it's an inefficient use of re-rendering. And if our components were to handle more information or do more operations or just be larger in general, this could become a problem in terms of performance. The solution to this problem is to use the useCallback hook. useCallback fixes this function redefinition issue by only ever redefining the function if values inside of it are going to change. We first need to import useCallback in our code. So right here where we're importing useState, let's add another import and we'll just say useCallback just like this. And then what we want to do is convert this, instead of saying function, we want to convert it to an arrow function. So to do that, all we need to do is place this with const here. Let's say const get count times 2. We'll keep the same name, equals, have the parameters here, and then let's have an arrow like this. So we've just basically remade it as an arrow function. Now we can wrap this entire function in a useCallback. So I'm going to add useCallback here, add a parentheses right here, and then add a closing parentheses on the edge here. And just like useMemo or useEffect, we can also add a dependency array as our second argument here. And again, just like useMemo or useEffect, the variables in the dependency array are basically going to specify when we want to redefine this function. So if any of the variables in the dependency array change, then this function will get called. So for right now, let's just add count to this array, because count is the only value that we actually really care about, and this function is the only value that's actually relevant. And this is exactly how we'd set up a useCallback hook. Now let's go ahead and test this. So I'm going to open up our console here. Let's clear this out, refresh the page here. And if we click increment count, it still says updating count, which makes sense because that's the intended functionality. Now, however, if we click change theme, it looks like it's still updating count. I think I forgot to save this file actually. Let me go ahead and save that. Let's refresh this, check that again. So if I click increment count, it's updating count. But now when we click change theme, notice how it is no longer updating count. And this is all because now that we've used useCallback, our function will only redefine itself whenever count changes, because we specified count in the dependency array of useCallback. This is one of the most common use cases of useCallback, when you're passing a function down to a child like we are here with the card component, and you don't want that child to keep re-rendering when that function is redefined on a re-render of the parent component. The second most common use case for a useCallback function comes with the useEffect hook. If you haven't already seen my useEffect guide, I recommend you watch that video to fully understand this particular example. Let's take a look at the second example here. So first off, we have two pieces of state. We have one called API data, that is just an object, and then we have one called URL, which is just a string. And then we have this grab data function that we are defining in our component. Grab data accesses data from some API and then stores that data in our API data piece of state. The URL it grabs from can be changed by the user, hence why it takes a URL in as an argument. In our JSX, we have a text field that allows us to enter in this URL. Right now, we're accessing an API called random user, which I will actually just paste in here. I will paste it in here, and notice how we are also JSON.stringifying our API data, which is what you just saw appear on the screen over here. Lastly, we have a useEffect here that just runs the grab data function. The only time the useEffect runs is right when the component renders and whenever this URL changes because it is in the dependency array. So this code looks fine, however there's one thing in here that may cause an issue. Anytime you have something inside a useEffect function that originates from outside the useEffect, React will tell you to put it in the dependency array. So for example, right now we have this grab data function inside the useEffect, but we are defining it outside of the useEffect. Therefore, React will either give us a warning or an error saying that we're missing dependencies in our dependency array. Therefore, logically, we would think we should add grab data to our dependency array like this. But then this creates an even bigger problem. Every single time React re-renders, it recreates this grab data function here. Even though the function itself isn't changing, the reference to it is. So therefore, that triggers a useEffect, which then calls the function, which then changes the state, and that cycle repeats forever, meaning we are creating an infinite loop. To show you that, watch this. I'm just going to console log here. I'm going to say test, and then I'm going to save this. And now I'm going to open up the console, and you can see it is calling this API basically every single second, and it is running this test over and over and over again. So clearly this is a problem. So let's go ahead and just quickly delete this from here, delete that from here, and get our useEffect back to normal so the infinite loop stops. The solution to this problem is again useCallback. So basically, anytime we have a function that we are defining outside of useEffect, but they want to use it inside the useEffect, we should use a useCallback hook for that. To have this scenario work successfully, let's go ahead and just wrap this function here in a useCallback. Same way we did last time. So add opening parentheses here, and then closing parentheses here. And then, just like we did before, we could add a dependency array as well. And then what we could do is remove the URL from our useEffect here, and instead add it to our useCallback dependency array up here. And this is because anytime that this URL changes, we want this function to run again because we need to fetch from the new URL. And then what we can do is we can re-add grab data back to our dependency array down here, and we can save it, and we'll no longer have an infinite loop. And I'll actually go ahead and just paste this API link back in here. And now you can see there's no longer an infinite loop problem. Now, I do want to make a note that there is an easier way to solve this problem that avoids having to use useCallback. And this is usually the alternative that I use because I rarely ever use useCallback. The method is to instead just define the function inside the useEffect. So to show you that, I'm actually going to go ahead and remove the useCallback here, and also remove the dependency array here. And then I'm just going to cut this. I'm going to paste it inside of our useEffect. So now we are redefining our function inside the useEffect itself. And then we can just grab data from the dependency array now. But if we're doing this, we would want to re-add URL to the dependency array. So let's add URL here. And let's go ahead and save this page now. And then you can see it is working the same as before without having to use useCallback. This is personally always the way I handle functions inside useEffect. If I need to call a function inside useEffect, I will always define that function inside useEffect as well, because that removes the need of having to add it to the dependency array. Before we wrap up, I want to make one quick note. If you're being smart about how you're handling the effects of state, and you're following good React practices, you're not going to need useCallback or useMemo all that often. Most examples I could show you involving useCallback and useMemo could be solved by just shifting a few things around and not using those hooks at all. Of course, there may be very particular scenarios where you may need useCallback or useMemo, but if you're using it all the time, you may be doing something wrong in your code. On that note, I hope this video was able to help you. If it did, please consider liking and subscribing as it helps me out tremendously. Take care and have a great rest of your day.